Welcome everybody to the Greenrush Consulting webinar series. These webinars, are designed to support you throughout the process, because obviously through this process, you have different dynamic changes that happen. New information comes out even towards the end in the middle of submission. There's information that comes out that could be very valuable to submitting not only a successful application, but, a winning one, right? And so we encourage you to just sort of wait, even though you may have your application together and you feel like it's 5-star, you want to add as much as you can in and get as much information in towards the end, all the way to the application submission. And these webinars, we're going to be doing, one a week, every Thursday at the same time, and updating folks on, these updates that we're receiving too as well. I believe we did submit a bunch of questions too, Tom, didn't we? Like a bunch of questions in this round. That is something that we definitely do every single time, and it helps us clarify some of the things associated with this that are unclear, whether in the regulations or, at, any meetings that we go to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, a little bit about like post-submission. Tom, tell us a little bit about like some of the things regarding post-submission. I know it's very similar to all the processes such as dispensary or processes going forward, but just kind of give us a recap of what that looks like so that way our audience understands.
Absolutely. So before we actually dive into post-submission, I do want to remind everyone that the state will start accepting applications on February 14th. Mm-hmm. They are going to stop accepting applications on March 16th at 5 p.m. CST. So make sure you have all of your applications, all of your application materials prepared, ready, assembled, and get them submitted before March 16th, 5 p.m. CST. That is the final deadline. Now, regarding post-submission, we know the state is being a little bit lenient as far as correcting your application materials. And so they are going to have a deficiency period where if certain aspects of your application aren't correct or maybe missing certain information, you will get a notification. Once you get the notification, you will have exactly 10 days to correct whatever is listed as incorrect and return it back to the state. Now, here's the hard part. We have yet to get clarification on what that information is. There's certain information that if you get wrong can be an automatic disqualification. There's certain information that if you get wrong or it's inaccurate, they're going to deduct points. We don't know what type of corrections the state's going to allow us to. So again, don't count on that as being a saving grace. Get your application materials as polished up as you can. Get them as near perfect as you can before March 16th. Again, you will have 10 days to polish certain things up, but we don't know what they're going to allow us to polish. So don't let that be your fallback plan. Get everything done and perfect as soon as you possibly can.
Right. And there's also, just a quick touch on, fees, specifically for a craft grower. It's a $5,000 application fee, non-refundable to the state. But if you're awarded a license, the fee for the actual license itself is $40,000. So make sure that you have that already ready to go, and you kind of, combine that with your current budget that you're looking at in terms of applying for one of these licenses. So I think that we should just deep dive a little bit into, into the exhibit list, right? Obviously, this is where the bulk of the material is going to be, the full application. And they have identified what those exhibits are. Some of them are very similar to the dispensary round, but obviously this is a whole nother license type, right? So, and you have to have a location with this too as well. So Tom, do you want to just take us down some of this exhibit list and kind of give us an overview of some of this?
Absolutely. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we'll go through the list of exhibits that are requirement, and then afterwards, Zeta will go ahead and tackle them individually and break them down, talk about the requirements, and maybe discuss from our own experience some of the red flags that we should look for and some of the curveballs. That way we can help make sure everyone is fully prepared for the process. So, all right, so for the exhibit list, you are going to be required to submit 19 different exhibits. Exhibit A is the suitability of the proposed facility plan. Exhibit B is the suitability of employee training plan. Exhibit C is your security plan and record keeping plan. Exhibit D is your cultivation plan. Or if you're going to go ahead and talk about manufacturing or infusion, that's going to vary slightly. Zeta will talk more about that in a little moment. Exhibit E is your product safety and labeling plan. F, business plan and services to be offered. G, social equity application materials. H, the applicant's labor and employment practices. Exhibit I is your environmental plan. J is Illinois residents controlled or owned proof. Exhibit K is proof of veteran controlled or owned status. Exhibit L is your diversity plan. Exhibit M is unique because it's your bonus section. It's going to contain a couple different items that are only going to be scored in the event of a tie. We'll go ahead and break that down more in a little bit. Exhibit N is your property ownership. You're going to need to prove a right to occupy the land that you're using. Exhibit O is notice of proper zoning. P, organizational information and financial interest disclosure. We'll go ahead and discuss that later on and also in upcoming webinars because that is a very, very dense thing we'll need to unpack. Exhibit R is the notarized statement. Exhibit S is a fingerprint consent form. And that's pretty much all the exhibits you'll need to apply. There's 19 of them.
So let's start with Exhibit A. I mean, the suitability of a proposed facility plan includes a lot of in-depth information. The total page limited on this is 50 pages, and it's worth 75 points. I mean, this is obviously a bigger one. Can you talk a little bit about some of the key points in this particular plan that relates to craft grower?
Absolutely. So Exhibit A, the suitability of the proposed facility, that question is asking for you to identify and address 3 different prompts. The first prompt is you need to demonstrate that the proposed facility is suitable for effective and safe cultivation of cannabis. The second thing you need to address is you need to demonstrate the ability to meet consumer demand by operating a craft grow facility in a safe and efficient manner with minimal impact on the environment and the surrounding community. The last thing you'll need to provide is an operations management practices plan. Now, they don't in the application actually describe or define what an operations management practices plan is. However, they do in the regulations. So if we go to the regulations, we can actually find the definition for operational management plan. According to the regulations, here's what needs to be included in the operational management plan. You need to discuss the types and quantities of cannabis products that will be produced at the cultivation center. You need to discuss your methods of planting, seeds or clone, harvesting, drying, storage, all the processing for your cannabis. You'll need to provide an estimate quantity of waste material that you're going to be generating. You also need to provide an estimate of the quantity and proposed method for disposal of all crop inputs, right? Fertilizers, any nutrients that you're going to be adding to the front end. You also need to describe your methods for training employees. You need to also discuss biosecurity measures to be implemented for plant production. Now, let's take a moment to kind of define biosecurity. I know most of us are probably thinking, oh, that's a thumbprint scan, it's a retina scan, it's the stuff we see on Mission Impossible. No, the way they're describing biosecurity in the regulations is this is specifically for integrated pest management. What they're really asking you to break down is how are you going to prevent any non-appropriate bioactive, biological activity, bugs, pests, anything that doesn't belong. So please note, when you get to that section and ask for biosecurity, it's asking for your intense integrated pest management plan and anything you're going to do to make sure your crops do not get contaminated, right? So be sure to refer to the definitions each and every single time you address a plan or a concept or any phrase that you see in your application process. It's all been defined for you. Go back to the regs if you have any question, right? So on top of that, you're also going to have to provide a planned response to discrepancies in your product inventory. You're going to have to provide a description of your sampling strategy for your quality assurance. You're going to have to provide procedures to follow proper labeling. And lastly, you're going to also have to provide procedures to follow handling mandatory and voluntary recalls of cannabis products, right? In the event that there is something wrong with one of your products, the state wants to know how you're going to handle this, how you're going to collect your products, how you're going to dispose of your products, and how you're going to communicate to the general market that your public is, or that your product rather, is actually being recalled. So that's how we're defining operational management plan. And that's again in the regs. So if you need to refer back to that, go look through the definitions of the reg. If you go through the definition sections of the regulations, you're going to find probably 80% of all the answers that you need looking for. It's all about just making sure everything you're doing meets the expectations of the state. The expectations of the state are defined in the definitions. So always refer back to the definitions. The definitions are your best friend.
Right. And so I think that, because this is such a variable area when we're talking about growers, okay? Because growers, they have their own style, their own methodology. And, typically we see, a few different types. There's, obviously soil, There's hydroponics, sometimes it's aeroponics, sometimes it's deep water culture. I mean, everybody has their own style of growing. And, it's very hard to streamline that if, or explain that for that matter in a short amount of pages that you have, when you have to explain also and define also the prop number one and prop number two, which is obviously, how effective you're going to be at cultivating cannabis, and also the consumer demand. So we're also looking at a market analysis in there about the community consumer demand by operating the grow facility in a safe, efficient manner. The impact of the, how you're going to, your environmental, practices for the surrounding community. But then this robust area that talks about all the things that Dr. Tom just mentioned, for that section. Now, in our application accelerator product, we have defined a lot of those different things. But I think that, for everyone that has a different style of growing, you're going to have to incorporate some of this information. Maybe you already have this information. Maybe you need this information. At the end of the day, we're looking at how do we get the right answer in this particular exhibit to the department within the page limit. And sometimes there's real savvy ways. I mean, I know we got some questions about this last time. A lot of people like to use bullet points, but sometimes it might be better to use a semicolon in space. So if I have multiple different operational policies and procedures, and I want to include that into, let's just say, a third of a page, you can do that. Instead of using bullet points and just knocking down your page limit, you can actually put it into a sentence. You can put it into multiple different things in terms of like, I have multiple different pieces in here with just semicolon. So that's really helpful when you're actually trying to demonstrate to the department of how much experience you have or what your policies and procedures look like for this section. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Tom?
I absolutely agree. Just to kind of touch on a couple of Zeta's points, you are going to have strict page requirements. So you need to be very, very, very strategic about that. And just to kind of highlight what Zeta said, bullet points might not be the most effective use of space. So one thing you need to keep in mind is you need to get even a little bit creative in even how you're structuring your content to kind of make sure it fits, right? I wanted to kind of touch on another thing that Zeta brought up. He mentioned the application accelerator. Zeta, can I ask you a little bit more about that? Because I'm not sure that everyone that's tuned in might be familiar with what that is right now.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So just a quick recap on that. So the application accelerator is a new type of product that our company has developed that is, truly, honestly changing the game. What I mean by that is that it's speeding up the time that it takes to actually get a compliant application done. So with the application, it's likely already 50 to 60% done, and it helps educate you, the applicant, on one, the process, two, it allows you to have a foundation to build your application off of without having to worry about all the other things. So at a fraction of the cost too, which is helping us, really, lower the barrier of entry in terms of people wanting to apply. And then second, saving you time and money associated with the development of the application itself. And we found an extreme amount of success in this in the last round. A lot of folks were really happy. In fact, we had one group that came in, 48 hours from submission. And, they were a pretty well outfitted group. They had a lot of experience and they knew what they were doing and had applied before. However, they were just out of time. So they used the application accelerator for dispensary and were able to get their application in and felt very, very happy with the results. So, I think it's really helping folks both do, get their application done enough time, or even add value to their application if they get it done sooner, right? So they have enough time here to add more compounding efforts in that. One of the questions that we just got in the chat was how many accelerators that we're accepting in the Illinois, where there really is no limit to the amount of accelerators that we're able to allow people to use, right? Because again, what they're going to do is take this compliant information, which they're going to need anyway, and then customize it to their brand, to their application, to their team, to their location, to their style. I mean, all that comes in with the effort, but it takes a very small amount of effort to do that. Sometimes we had some folks that came in that either got screwed over by their consultants and they were just left, high and dry, and they didn't know what to do. This was an awesome solution for them. We had some folks come in and they were just comparing our materials against what their other consultant did. And really we're able to kind of sort of piece all that together to create a master plan that really, really helped him exceed in that area. So it really, really helped in that area, so I think that's really what it's used for. Now, it doesn't complete the entire application, just so everybody knows. There's a lot of stuff that can't be automated, right? We've tried to automate as much as possible for you guys, but when it comes down to, there's things like architectural drawings that, we can't automate, or, specific aspects like, obviously, any lease agreements or LOIs or anything like that. So really, there's a certain amount of groundwork, from team building to raising capital to however you want to look at it, that is very manual in its case. But when you stack that on top of having to write an application like this, it becomes very cumbersome. And so the application accelerator really just fills the void, fills that gap, and accelerates the process to where your focus is really getting all those other materials together. And then from that point, you're just going to input and plug in whatever you need to plug in into the application accelerator, and then beef it up from there to provide value. And really, that in a nutshell is what the application accelerator does. And again, it's an incredible product. We're very, very thrilled to be able to offer this to the industry, and being the first to do it too as well. So that is, in summary, how it can help you on all 3 license applications, not just craft grower, but also infuser. And we're coming out with one for transporter too as well. So that's that. Coming back to the exhibits, I think that, let's kind of move on a little bit. Let's go to suitability of employee training plan. Tom, can you explain a little bit about that to us a little bit? Just give us a quick rundown on that one.
Yeah, so basically for the suitability of employee training plan, what you're going to be required to provide responses for is, 1, you're going to need to describe a staffing plan that will provide and ensure adequate staffing and experience for accessible business hours, safe production, sanitation, security, and theft prevention. Once you're done with that, you're also going to need to provide an employee handbook that will provide employees with the working guidelines of all administration policies for the facilities, right? So your suitability of employment training plan is two main parts. It's your staffing plan and then your employee handbook. Now, this exhibit is 50 pages, or no, it's 15 pages. It's worth 50 points, but this does not include your handbook. So you need to make sure that in prompt 1, you are using all of those full 15 pages to answer your staffing plan, because they are not counting the pages of your employee handbook. That you will simply attach, and that does not count against the page count limitations. So be aware of that. You want to go ahead and you want to maximize those 15 pages on your labor and staffing plan, as indicated in the prompt.
Would agree with that too as well. I mean, this is another section where, it's just talking about a lot of these different aspects to this. And I think it's very valuable in terms of that. I think, how did we do? I think we did pretty well in the security section, but again, this is cultivation, right? So we got different folks working in different areas as opposed to dispensary. So there's only so much that could be transferred over. But at the end of the day, we are still talking about a cannabis business, and it still needs to be secured in the same way, and in terms of how you're going to train your employees. So that's great. So speaking of security,
Yep.
Let's move on to Exhibit C. Another robust plan. The page limit is 65. I think this was doubled in the dispensary, wasn't it, Tom?
This was actually double. It's
right.
Good. Actually, one of the things we're noticing with the exhibit page count this time around for craft grower cultivation, the page requirements are basically double than it was for dispensary. So the state right there is looking for a little bit more minutia than you would on the dispensary level. And so this is where you really get the opportunity in certain areas to kind of talk about how you're not just meeting the standards, but you're really going above and beyond what the state is expecting. Now, just kind of bring it back to the application accelerator, we do that. A lot of our content is already geared towards best management practices. Anything that exceeds what those expectations are, we go ahead and include that content and make it optional for you if you agree to use it. That way, your application is as strong as possible and you can leverage as many points. One thing we should also know about Exhibit C, the security plan, is it does have to be reviewed by the Illinois State Police.
Obviously, security is one of the highest, usually one of the highest scoring plans in every state that we go to, in every application process that we've ever seen. And obviously it's very important. I mean, when you look at communities, the number one concerns are security, and how it's going to impact the community, the surrounding community around it. Obviously, the state, is putting a lot of emphasis on this, and always does. One of the things I want to talk about is kind of sort of going back to the beginning of our webinar a little bit, talking a little bit about location, because I want to make sure everybody's clear on this. that, the state is saying that you could have a proposed location. Well, we have actual accurate floor plans to go off of when it comes to drafting the security plan overlay or the security plan, specifications around the facility. We know the exact community metrics around that location. We know who and what is going to be a barrier to entry when it comes down to how our community outreach is being performed. We know so much data from the patients that we can serve, or in a case of a dispensary, or how much we can grow in that space or scale at a later date if the state allows us to do. So there's so many different reasons why having a location is better than just having a proposed location, even though let's say that it may not be scored any points, or that they're just saying that it can be a proposed location. I like it when states do this because states, when they say proposed, that allows more people to participate in the process, but doesn't mean that their application is going to turn out at a higher quality, not necessarily, not all the time. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that difference, right, in terms of it, even though the state says that, because you need to look further into detail about what the state is actually saying. If you do lease a space, or if you own the space, then you're going to need to submit a written statement that the landlord or you are certifying consent, to be able to allow this type of business use there. So I just wanted to point that out. And next with security, I mean, like, what's the take a difference between craft grow and infuser and transporter, right? Because craft grow and infuser are fixed locations where the operations are happening within that location. But transporter also has a fixed location, but you're also dispatching vehicles out, right, which require things like GPS tracking potentially, or a robust system which allows you to monitor how that happens. Or let's just say working in coordination with state police when you're doing deliveries, and having a tactical response team if something happens, right? There's more cash handling involved. As a transporter, you are working with every single cultivator and infuser within the state, delivering to dispensaries, right? But there's also cash handling, and there's other things there happening too as well. So with that particular application, there's going to be a different level of, or an additional level, should I say, of emphasis on security and record keeping, specifically with Exhibit C. And we do address this a lot in our transporter application accelerators that are, that will be coming out. But I want to make that clear that there is a little bit of a difference with that one as opposed to this one. In terms of security. One second, we had this question come in, and the question is, do you need city zone approval or just an owner of the location approval to propose the grow? I think, what do you think about that, Tom? I'll let you answer that one.
So we need to demonstrate, one of the requirements that we actually have to submit is a zoning form. It's one of the exhibits. So essentially that zoning form is an attestation saying that you have done your own research and the property you have selected, whether you actually own it or leasing it or it's proposed, is properly zoned. So that is what we are required in the application. We do have to fill out a zoning attestation form. That does not necessarily, and again, we're communicating with the state on this right now, it has not been clarified whether or not that actually requires local approval. So that is something we will go ahead and get back to you in our next webinar once we hear back from the state.
Right. Right. And again, we're waiting, like the state will clarify this, but yeah, that is a proper zoning form. I would imagine that, that is the local zoning authority that needs to sign off on this, right? But, for now, again, as we go through these shifting sands with the state and getting some more of that clearer information, we'll be able to update people, on that. So, moving past security and record keeping, let's talk about this cultivation plan, because this is where we're going to get a lot of variables. In terms of, obviously there's best practices when it comes to, operating a grow facility, but I think that, we're going to get a lot of variables in this. What do you think, Tom? Why don't you go ahead and explain a little bit about that for us, would you?
Yeah, so the cultivation plan, it's going to consist of 3 different elements. The first element is your plan to provide a steady, uninterrupted supply of cannabis to registered dispensaries. The second part is going to be you demonstrating knowledge of your cultivation method that you'll be using at the proposed facility, as well as your knowledge of the various strains that you'll be cultivating and the associated methods to grow those strains. The last thing you will need to provide is you will need to demonstrate the steps that will need to be taken to ensure the quality of your cannabis, including the purity and consistency of any cannabis or any products that you go ahead and produce at your facility. So one of the strategies that we want to kind of make clear as you're going into your cultivation plan is, if we go back to prompt one is asking, describe your plan to provide a steady, uninterrupted supply of cannabis to registered dispensaries. Now, this sounds easy, but this is kind of a trick question. What you need to go ahead and do is you want to go ahead and define what steady is, what that uninterrupted supply will require. So the state's asking to provide a benchmark. They're asking you to anticipate demand, outline that demand, and then discuss how your facility and your operational and your experience will make sure that each time you harvest, you're going to meet those benchmarks that the state is already assuming, right? So it's a little bit of a trick question. Be sure to address productivity of your facility and include some market analytics with prompt one of the cultivation plan. Again, it's not a business plan, but you want to go ahead and qualify what steady and uninterrupted would look like. So that's how you can go ahead and leverage some market dynamics in Exhibit D, which is your application or your cultivation plan. Now, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, I don't have these market numbers or figures. A lot of this is coming available live. Just do some quick Google research. Go ahead and try to adopt some metrics from states that have similar patterns. Get creative with it. But what you want to do is you want to qualify and demonstrate that you've thought of what that requires as far as quantity.
Right. And also, I think I can add some to that too as well. I mean, not only just, basing your operations and steady supply on market analytics or adoption rates, say, or because there's really no way of telling that at the moment. Like, I think Illinois ran out of weed when the adult use came out or something. So like literally this happens on every single state. It's a lot of shifting sands there. And so I think that, when it comes down to, you just got to do the best you can in terms of understanding that adoption rate on a base metric. And then also equivalent to how much product you're going to have on site. Now, you probably want to demonstrate that you can show that, hey, in the event that we, do sell out, hopefully, we will have at least 20 or 30% or 50% on site, to be able to serve even more and demonstrate that uninterrupted supply. What do you think about that, Tom?
No, absolutely. I mean, again, the point is to kind of demonstrate that you're in production capacity and you have enough experience and know-how and knowledge to make sure that there isn't going to be that shortage, right? They want to make sure that as they're going through this process, they're not going to license someone who in 6 weeks isn't going to be producing enough to meet the market. Therefore, people are waiting and there's another shortage. If you look at it from the state of the perspective, what they're trying to do is they're trying to vet us to make sure that when we get a license, we will always produce X, and therefore there will never be a shortage, and therefore the state will never actually have to go through this process again because they don't want to go through this process, right? So we want to demonstrate to them that we know what the market anticipates, we can meet that demand, and also in line with the state's intentions, we want to demonstrate that we can also scale up. One of the things that the state has talked about is they want to go ahead and revisit cultivation sizes. And one of the things they proposed is in the future, they might scale up or allow scaling up in increments of 3,000 square feet, right? So the state is paying particular attention to market demand, and they're trying to base their number of licenses and the size of these craft grow facilities based on market demand. So again, it's all about proving that you will never be a hindrance or create a shortage or cause a lack of product available to the consumer market. That's really what they're looking for with that.
Right. And I totally agree with that. And yeah, the state has indicated something about scalability. They haven't given a path forward or mechanism for that yet, but I think that it's going to be really about demonstrating, do you have the ability to scale? Do you need to scale? And then those increments, I think there's a cap on those increments of 15,000 too as well. I think it's 3,000 for every single time and then up to 15,000. But again, that's still yet to be seen. We also have large scale cultivation licenses coming out too as well, those centers. But that's not this round. This is just craft grower this round. So those aren't even available yet either. Moving on to number 2 on the cultivation plan, demonstrating the knowledge of cultivation methods to be used. Again, this is something I mentioned earlier about, how everybody's got their own methodologies. You want to just really not go too far into depth and down the rabbit hole when it comes to your cultivation methodology. You really want to try to stick to something that people are familiar with. So if it's top feed in Rockwell, okay, great. If it's top feed in cocoa, okay, great. I just don't go too far down that realm because you want to save some space for things like your experience, things like how you're going to ensure the quality of cannabis, testing methodologies, purity and consistency, things like that. So I would be careful about number two, about going too far down there, explaining the strains, explaining this. I think that, selecting, when you're talking about strains, it's like, why are you selecting these strains? I mean, variety and diversity is very, very important. But I think that selecting between, here's all of our diverse sets of strains that have, let's just say, a different flowering time than these ones that are mainly going through our production cycle to produce product for the state. These are all different elements you have to decide as a grower and limit as a grower as much as possible to a point where you're getting the point across, it's solid, but from that point you have space for all these other places that you need to explain in this particular exhibit. Again, with our product, we actually make that a little bit easier for you. But again, you are the grower, you are the master grower, or maybe you've secured a master grower, and they will be able to tell you, what's the appropriate methodology is in terms of, are we using LEDs, or are we using HID? Are we, doing other types of styles and methodologies that would help your cost? So I think that is a very important one there for Exhibit D, and it's going to be probably one of the tougher ones, I feel like, that people have to really define in this process. I mean, would you agree, Tom?
Absolutely. And on that note, everyone, as you're doing your cultivation plan, please go back to the regs. There are requirements about light usage, about how many watts per square foot you can go ahead and use. And also there are strict requirements for water. So as you're putting together your cultivation plan, make sure your lead cultivator is aware of all of these regulations so that when you craft your plan, you're not talking about stuff that's already out of compliant, right? So keep in mind, Illinois is focused on the conservation of water and the conservation of electricity via the consumption of lights. So as you're putting together your cultivation, perhaps lighting plans, make sure you select a light that has been pre-approved by the state of Illinois. They've released information that guides you in that direction. So make sure you are picking a compliant lighting system. Also make sure that your irrigation system is also compliant and in line with the wishes of the state, which is, again, conservation.
Okay, great. So moving on, I think that let's move on to Exhibit E, because, again, there's only so much time here for this webinar, so I want to make sure that we cover everything. So Tom, why don't you go ahead and move into, we'll move some of these questions towards the end that we're receiving right now, so make sure to cover everybody's questions too as well. We're not going to leave you hanging, but I want to move on to Exhibit E, a product safety and labeling plan. Why don't you explain a little bit about that?
All right, so just like the other exhibits, Exhibit E, the product safety and labeling plan, it asks you to provide 3 different responses, 3 different narratives, if you will, to different prompts. The first prompt is your plan for safe and accurate packaging and labeling of cannabis. Make sure you are fully compliant. The second prompt is your plan for testing cannabis and ensuring that all cannabis is free from contaminants, kind of your quality control measures. And the last prompt is you need to describe your plan for establishing a product recall in the event of a product defect or adverse health consequence related to any of your products or any of the products that you've produced. So that's, again, getting back to your recall plan. How are you going to identify the products that need to be recalled? How are you going to report this to the state? And how are you going to make these announcements to the market so that anyone with one of these products can go ahead and return it or go through the proper process of recall? Also, what is your process for the actual recall? Make sure you cover all of those aspects in Exhibit E.
Right. I mean, it's always really important on any one of these exhibits that when the prompt comes up, it's not just about, I mean, it's like the how you're going to do this, right? I mean, we have a recall plan that constitutes this, and these are all the actions that we have. So when you're developing this, it's really important to just make sure you answer the how and not just say the why or the what. I mean, it's all about that how, like, how are we going to do this, right? So that's really important. I think that, moving on to Exhibit F, business plan, this is also a robust section too. I mean, this is all about, it's also 60 page limits or 60, because our page limit is 60 pages, sorry. Why don't you explain a little bit about this, Tom? I mean, I think that would be helpful for our viewers, because this is another very, very important section. And it also, highlights exactly what you're trying to do in your business. So why don't you kind of explain that to us?
Yeah, so the business plan, Exhibit F, it's probably going to be one of the more difficult documents that you're going to have to prepare. It's kind of pretty broad in scope. In fact, the first thing they're asking for is a business plan that describes how the craft grower plans to operate on a long-term basis. So again, we need to understand certain benchmarks and metrics to qualify that long-term standing, and a detailed description about the amount and source of equity and debt commitment and financial feasibility, right? So First, we're going to have to talk about the market, our plans to kind of meet those markets. And then we're going to also have to discuss some of our financing solutions, right? What's our startup use? What's our sources of uses? Now, keep in mind, the state wants to make sure that we're not going to go out of business halfway through the process, forcing them to go through another licensing process that they don't want to do. So while you may not be graded or scored on the amount of funds that you have, it's not going to hurt to have as much possible. Again, one of the things that you want to do here for strategy and leverage is you want to demonstrate that your facility can operate for as long as possible before the market actually matures. If you can demonstrate you can go 6 months to a year, assuming the market hasn't matured yet, that's going to look really good on your application, right? Especially since a lot of this is still speculative. We don't know the rate of adoption. I mean, we can project it, but it's still a unique state. So we can only prepare for that. But if we can demonstrate that worst case scenario, the market's half of what we thought, that's not going to affect or impede our business. It's a quarter of what we thought. That's still not going to affect us for the first year of operation, as long as it continues to scale up. So that's where we want to demonstrate that you've thought out the worst case scenario and the best case scenario. I think you're on mute, Zeta. There you go.
What about number two? I mean, number two is also a pretty hefty one, and obviously, just demonstrate that you have this experience. I mean, I think that a lot of folks may or may not have this type of level of cannabis specific experience. So, we want to just highlight that you have been operating a farm for the last, 50, 100 years, or you've worked with multiple farms there. Maybe you're already in the hemp realm doing that. All of these things apply to this. I mean, wouldn't you say that, Tom?
Absolutely. So for the second part, any type of cannabis experience, obviously put that in there. Any type of horticultural or agricultural experience, that also will play as well. So in that experience section, you want to point to any type of industrial, commercial, agricultural, horticultural, or cultivation that you've done. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter the scale, but you want to point out that, hey, you're familiar with these practices, and therefore you will be able to take best management practices from the existing agricultural industry and horticultural industries and seamlessly apply them to your cannabis facility, right? So that's why they're asking for experience outside of cannabis, because it's a highly regulated industry, but it's not the only highly regulated industry. We know horticulture, we know agriculture. They are regulated in similar ways. So you are getting the leverage of having experience in those realms because in theory, it will help you adopt and adapt your business model to the cultivation industry that much easier, that much quickly, and that much more efficiently.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, the last one here is pretty interesting too, as well. I mean, obviously a startup timetable, they want to know, how long is construction going to take? How long is ordering equipment and supplies going to take? What's your staffing look like in terms of hiring? When are you going to be operational, right? So I think that, would you include like it says you got to provide a timetable. So I would imagine that it would be in the form of with cells and a timetable. Would you agree with that? In terms of how you would present that, or would it be just in word form, or just in word and text? Like, how would you present that, Tom?
So in this case, I would actually do both. We can probably go ahead. The way that I would prepare it, most when I do a timeline production, it's not necessarily a linear timeline like that. It's more of a top down and it kind of shows overlaps. You can do a condensed graphic. That's if you worked with a construction contractor before, that's typically how they do it. So in a quarter of a page, I can create a visual that will contain my entire timeline. Now, what I want to go ahead and do is after that in narrative form, I want to go ahead and preemptively address any hiccups that I might see or any problems or any other processes that I'm going to have to go through. Now, in highlighting some of those bumps, that's normally not what you want to do, but what you're demonstrating to the state is that you've done your due diligence. You understand that getting these additional permits is going to be part of the process. You're demonstrating to the state that, oh, just because you've got your cannabis license doesn't mean you're ready to go. You still got to work with your local municipalities to get your build permit, your right to occupy permit, your entitled permits. So the more detail that you can break down your timeline to include a lot of these practical steps, you will demonstrate to the state that you have a high likelihood of success because you know the process and you're that much more sound.
Yeah, and I also want to emphasize on this too as well, and just from a competitive nature, and especially when we're working with smaller sort of micro growers, should I say, not large scale cultivation. I almost feel like from a construction timetable standpoint, since it's a shorter amount of time to outfit an existing facility, starting from the ground up, which obviously that timetable would take a lot longer. I would think that the state's interpretation of that, would they like favor, I don't want to say favor, but would they like award more per se, to a facility that is just going to have a short timeline. They're going to be in operation very quickly, as opposed to starting from the ground up. I mean, what do you think, in terms of selecting the right proposed location or existing location, how that would impact the application and the scores themselves, saying, okay, we have one group right here that's well capitalized. We have another group that's well capitalized. They both have experience. They're both solid groups. They both score very high in all the areas. But now I'm looking at, okay, this one's going to be up and running faster than this one. What do you think about that?
So here's where you can get strategic. So first of all, the state hasn't really released any rules about how they're going to be kind of scoring that section as of yet. I mean, they've released guidelines, but they haven't specifically said we will give more points to someone who can be operational faster. However, what we do need to consider is that the scorers are human beings. It's a political process. So anytime someone can make the promise to be there first to market, that's probably going to carry some sort of inherent value, whether or not it's been articulated in the laws or the scoring criteria. So my argument is going to always be faster is better in this case, right? Now, if you're working with let's say you're building a brand new facility and it's going to take longer, you can counter that by including a pro forma that demonstrates your likelihood to succeed. So 2 points that you can leverage. You want to leverage that you're going to be first to market or early to market. That's going to look good. If you can't leverage that, you definitely want to leverage the fact that you've done your due diligence, you've done your number crunching, you understand the process, and you will be one of the longest standing entities possible. Because again, they want to get this process over with and move on to the next phase. So they want people operational as soon as possible, and they want to know that this person's never going to go out of business. So if you can't prove necessarily that you're going to be one of the first, reinforce through your content that you've done your number crunching. You might be the last company standing if it comes down to that. So that's how you can kind of counter that. But yes, if you can get to market quicker, that's obviously going to look better. Now, disclaimer, the state again has not said we're going to go ahead and award more points to people that are faster. But again, we know that scoring, that it's not necessarily fully transparent. So I would go ahead and try to get to market as quick as possible.
Yeah, I mean, like from our standpoint, I mean, we deployed so many different excellent strategies that did get us over the line over another competitor. And like, I think that's a great point, Tom, that you just made. It actually sparked another thought in my mind around how, if you were building from the bottom, you can phase your construction out and have certain grow rooms that are already ready producing product while you're doing the rest of your construction to show that you have speed to implementation to market. That's another like good strategy to use when you're building from the ground up, as opposed to competing with another group that already has outfitting a facility and getting there faster. So it's all about how quickly can you get that product to market, within your operational timetable and your general internal operations of getting it there. And I think that's another great methodology around that. Now, another little compounding effect here to this particular section and this particular question, is about how you're going to promote economic empowerment in disproportionately impacted areas, which is a very, very important piece to this, or just in general. I mean, I think that, when it comes down to it, this needs to be included in that question, where the timetable is. At what stage do you think you can provide the economic empowerment? I think it can be from the very beginning of being able to do this, but through hiring folks, in that process of development, to starting with your staffing plan, whatever that looks like, working with groups that operate in these areas and provide more economic empowerment in those areas. I mean, I wanted to see what you thought, Tom, about that, but that's another important area here. What do you think?
That's a very, very important area. And thank you for bringing that back up, Seda, because one of the things that we should actually include in our timeline is benchmarks of when we plan to launch some of these initiatives that we want to do for community enhancement, right? So Seda mentioned, at the beginning, you might not be able to fund or sponsor a series of events, but you can promote economic enhancement through hiring of locals. So what you want to do on that timeline is actually describe your hiring practice. Now, at that moment, that might also include going to local community colleges, local colleges, hiring fairs to actually make sure you are pulling from the local community. If that is the case, which it should be, you want to include that on your timeline, right? For operations, 4 weeks before we open, we're going to start staffing and training people. We're going to attend these events, these events, these events. We're going to work with these entities to help find these people. We're going to work with these other entities to help staffing, etc. Include all of that early on. And then once you demonstrate that your company's operational and making money again, that's where you can say, okay, so by the end of hopefully year one, or maybe Q1 year 2, we're going to go ahead and sponsor this initiative. And you want to include that in your timeline. Maybe by Q3, we're going to go ahead and sponsor or start working with a bunch of other cultivation facilities to launch some sort of, community enhancement plan that's multi-licensed operator wide. That you want to go ahead and include your timeline as well, because you want to show to them, hey, look, we've thought about the entire business practice, and that includes community enhancement as well, just to say that up.
Excellent. I think that's a great strategy there. So speaking of economic empowerment, let's move on to Exhibit G, social equity applicant. Now I know, any folks that had gone through the dispensary process probably has a clear understanding of what qualifies for social equity, or qualifies as a social equity applicant. So why don't you just give us a quick rundown on that, and just like refresher for this particular section, Tom, if you could. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go through the social equity applicant requirements. Disclaimer, we're going to cover this a bit more in depth in a couple of our webinar series, because I'm sure there's going to be much more FAQs, more changes to this. Also, we're going to have another webinar series featuring LP, who's our senior regulatory analyst. This is really her bread and butter right now, so we'll have her break this down a little bit more in upcoming webinars. But yeah, I can go ahead and provide the qualifications for social equity applicant. So, 1, evidence of the applicant's status as an Illinois resident, as demonstrated by incorporating documents, or if applying by individual, by providing a signed lease agreement that includes the applicant's name, a property deed that includes the applicant's name, property name, also includes school records, your voter registration card, your driver's license or ID, a paycheck stub, and a utility bill, and other proof of residency as needed. So the first point is to prove that you're an Illinois resident. Second, you need evidence that you are owning and controlling more than 51% of the craft grow facility, and that you have lived in a disproportionately impacted area for 5 of the preceding 10 years, right? Again, you can use the same documentation that we discussed above to prove that. That includes pay stubs, leases, mortgages, voter registration, all the stuff that we mentioned. 3, you need to provide evidence that you are owning and controlling more than 51% of the pro's craft grower, and that you have been perhaps arrested or have been arrested or convicted of or adjudicated of a delinquent for any offense made by the Expungement Act of Public Act 101-0027. Again, we're going to have LP break that down a little bit more. It's a lot of legalese that she can kind of simplify for you, so I won't hash on that one. Sorry, everyone. 4, evidence the person owning and controlling more than 51% of the proposed craft grow has had a parent, legal guardian, child, spouse, dependent, or was a dependent of an individual who prior to June 25th, 2019, was arrested for, convicted of, or adjudicated for any offense made eligible by the Expungement Act. Again, we'll have LP break down the Expungement Act a little bit more in depth in our later webinars, so we can be sure to address that properly. 5, evidence that the applicant employs 10 or more full-time employees, and evidence that 51% or more of these employees currently reside in a disproportionately impacted area, or have been arrested for, convicted of, or adjudicated of any offense that is eligible, again, under the Public Act 101-0027. And 3, are members of an impacted family, as that defined by 101-0027. So those are the 3 options for point 5. You reside in a disproportionately, or requirements rather, my apologies. You reside in a disproportionately impacted area. You've been arrested, convicted of, or adjudicated for any offense defined in Public Act 101-0027, or you are members of a family that have been through that same process.
Right. Yeah. So thanks for giving us a little refresher on that, Tom. Like, they have posted FAQs around social equity applicants on the Department of Agriculture's website, where all the applications are available, and FAQs will remain to be available as they get updated during this process. But I would imagine that, this would be identical, if not very similar to the dispensary process too as well, because I don't think they've changed any of those rules from what I can see. So we'll keep an eye on that. And again, like I said, in later webinars, just like Tom said, we will have more updated information there. So moving on to, Exhibit H and Exhibit J. Let's just try to put those 2 together if we can, and just go one by one. I mean, what do you think about applicant labor and employment practices, Tom? I mean, this section, obviously, we want to help people and give them great careers. So I think this is what this is all about, right?
This is all about that, but it's also about occupational safety, right? They want to make sure that the workplace environment that you're providing is absolutely safe for your employees. There's not going to be any health hazards. There's not going to be any cultural problems that would, impede productivity. all of that. They also want you to go ahead and talk about some of the benefits that you'll be providing to your employees, such as healthcare benefits, educational benefits, retirement benefits, living wage standards, and they also want to know if you'll be entering into a labor peace agreement with your employees and with one of the local unions. So that's pretty much what they're asking for in your applicant's labor employment practices. I would go ahead and suggest that if you haven't already, establish what local unions are around, what local labor unions are around, and go ahead and start to make that connection and try to get that labor peace agreement sooner rather than later. It's one of those low-hanging fruit that you should just kind of get done with your application as soon as possible, that we can just set aside and not have to worry about it. You're on mute, Zeta.
Keep missing that. That is definitely absolutely correct, Tom. I appreciate you explaining that. Now, what about this environmental plan? Now, again, we're dealing with a cultivation site, right? That has the potential to impact the environment in a very adverse way. I mean, we're seeing this in California right now. We've seen it for a long time where, we have multiple agencies that are trying to govern this particular aspect right here. All the way down to things like, okay, you have a greenhouse outside and your lights are on during the evening hours, you got to find a way to adjust that because it's affecting bug life reproduction cycles. So I think that there's multiple different arguments for environmental impact when it comes to these types of facilities. I mean, you have some folks, dumping their nutrients down the drain, and that's going into, different biological ecosystems and water, and stuff like that. So how would you deal with this, or explain a little bit about this section, the various questions and why it's so important, even though it's only worth 20 points and the page limit is 10, it's responsible operations and having the responsibility of those operations. So why don't you explain a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So again, two different prompts for the environmental plan. Let's go ahead and go through them and unpack them a little bit and see how we can kind of strategize and leverage that. Prompt 1 is provide or demonstrate a plan to minimize the carbon footprint, environmental impact, and resource needs for the production of cannabis. All right, so we know a lot of basic practices to minimize carbon footprint. We can recycle a bunch of organics, but what I want to kind of go to specifically is where it says resource needs for the production of cannabis. Now, as far as resources at this moment, keep in mind your light bill is what they're actually talking about, right? How much electricity you're going to be using for your lights, not only how much water you're going to be using. Again, conservation is the goal here. We know that this is the goal because the state has told us so. They've regulated the amount of wattage that we can use for our lights, and they've actually gone so far as to prepare a list of approved lighting systems. So again, make sure your lighting system is compliant, and then also make sure that when you get to this section, you're talking about how much wattage or how many watts per day you're actually cutting back on. And from that, you want to go ahead and compare it to a traditional 1,000 watt HID, right? So if you're going LED and your LED uses, let's say, I'm just going to throw a number out there, 300, that's what you want to emphasize, right? You have selected this light intentionally to minimize our electricity needs. Also, when you're thinking about your cultivation and your irrigation methods, keep that in mind, right? You want to minimize any water usage, especially runoff, right? Zeta mentioned in the old days, people would be dumping that stuff down the drain. That's definitely not compliant anymore right now. So what they want you to do is identify how much runoff you're going to have based off your productivity. So this is one of those areas where if you can find ways to mitigate your actual runoff and reduce it, that's going to score you points. If you can grow your plants in absolute agronomic harmony and argue that you don't have any runoff, that's going to look ideal to the state because there's no possible way of you contaminating, right? So you want to eliminate any sense of doubt the state might have, right? If you're coming out saying, oh, we're going to have 50 gallons of runoff for each day, that's going to eventually lead someone to think, well, are they actually going to be able to dispose of that efficiently versus someone who says we have no runoff? So think about your cultivation methods. I know a lot of cultivators, they're set in our ways. They're set in their ways. And they don't want to change, but this is a merit-based process. So if you do want to get in, you might have to revisit some of your cultivation practices.
Well, I also think that let's just take and set aside this exhibit for the actual license itself, right? But going into, just operational practices, this section, by being very strategic in this section here, is going to help you save money. in the process by reducing carbon footprint or watching out for, you know, I mean, obviously it's going to save you from a lot of violations too, but, you know, when it comes down to it, it's like, I'm thinking about like things like, okay, use of alternative energy in the next question, right? I mean, you know, how are we going to curb some of that energy cost, you know, down through different various means, you know, or different methodologies and practices, right? And of course, treatment of wastewater and treatment exchange there, you know, we all know that, you know, having carbon filtration in there is very important to be able to, you know, exchange, you know, treat that air, make sure it doesn't leave the facility, et cetera, et cetera. You know, but I think that like, when we really looked at some of these sections in terms of an operational standpoint, operational detail, we have found that, you know, just focusing on this area, you'll save little pieces and that add up on the bottom line in terms of, you know, what kind of money you can make off of this, as well as, you know, what kind of production standards that you're implementing. I mean, always be in the pursuit of excellence when it comes down to this. And, you know, I think that, you know, curbing some of those methodologies and really just trying to figure out what the best is. Automation, very, very key there too as well, to this particular section. So maybe, you know, I think that, you know, especially with number 2 or this particular section in general, it's more than just those points. It's about like having responsible operations that help the environment, period. Right. And so I think that that is an important thing to note. Moving on to Exhibit J and K, you know, I think this is pretty self-explanatory for the audience. What do you think, Tom? I mean, I think this is pretty self-explanatory. You know, 51% controlled, you know, is regarding to this veteran controlled aspect over here, and 51% of being an Illinois resident. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory in terms of what needs to be done there. And if there's a form for that on the application, that'll explain that too as well. But it's clearly defined in the application itself. What about diversity plan? Why don't you explain a little bit about that? It's Exhibit L. Why don't you give us a little bit about that, Tom, would you?
Yeah, absolutely. So before we jump into Exhibit L, I just want to let everyone know that we're scheduling this for an hour. We're going a little bit long, so we just want to let everyone know that we're going to keep going. We're going to get through the rest of the remaining exhibits to answer all of your questions. Also, we are having an additional webinar series, so please make sure that you get questions to us so that we can address them in the future webinars. And also, please continue providing feedback. It's super helpful and it's helping us refine our product. So again, to just kind of reaffirm what Zeta said, yeah, a lot of the forms we'll cover in more detail later with our policy compliance expert, who will really kind of break down some of the legal language to help you make sense of that, right? So let's go ahead and dive right into the diversity plan. So first thing we need to know is that the diversity plan is 2,500 words, and it is a narrative that establishes a goal of diversity in ownership, management, employment, and contracting to diverse participants, right? So I want to highlight right away that obviously we know ownership, we expect that. Management, we expect. Employment, right? We have to maintain diverse employment practices, and also we have to maintain a diverse network of contractors now, right? The vendors we select, the people that we work with, the other retailers that we're going to be distribution to, all of those need to be considered in line with our diversity plan. Now, those benchmarks haven't necessarily been set by the state, so that's somewhere where you're going to have to kind of describe how much effort you're going to put into your diversity plan, right? What your goals are, what your ideologies are, what your main mission for that is. So as you go through the diversity plan, make sure it lines up with your business plan, your cultivation plan, and it's telling the exact same story. One of the things that we like to tell a lot of our clients is, yes, there are 19 separate exhibits, but these 19 separate exhibits need to come together and tell the exact same story perfectly, which means they all need to be lined up. So whatever you're discussing in your diversity plan, make sure it lines up with things in your timeline, right? You might be doing diversity hiring workshops, which getting back to your production timeline should be included. So make sure you tell the exact same story once you figure out what your mission and goals for your diversity plan are. That is crucial to success for this plan. And it's worth 100 points.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that's just really important to really focus on this and align with groups that are focused on this. I mean, this is a really important piece to this. So, you know, moving on to Exhibit M, bonus section. Now, this is in the event that they score identical to each other, and now it's a decision part, right? Based on these 2 additional plans. Now, just because it says optional, you always want to submit even if it says optional, right? I mean, I think that you always want to have that in place and make sure you can score the max out on page count, max out as much as possible. But for the bonus section, it's a few different ones. I mean, it's the community benefits plan, the substance abuse prevention plan, as well as a local community neighborhood report. So Tom, if you could kind of break some of those down for us, that would be helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this will probably be the last exhibit that we break down today, because the remaining exhibits, just like K&L, were forms that we're going to go ahead and break down later. So we'll go ahead and dive into M. But before we do, I just want to let everyone know that we are actually offering a discount for individuals who are attending the webinar series right now. You can go ahead and get 10% off of the application accelerator if you purchase. We will go ahead and send out a code, or if you go ahead and call and just let us know, we'll give you that discount. But that will be made available and will be good until next Wednesday. Or rather beginning of the next webinar. So
yeah, to buy that too, it would be actually, it's like 60% off, because right now we're at 50% off, until the 1st. And then we're adding additional 10% for all the attendees of this webinar that want to purchase it. So it's a total of 60% off the total price of what it will be on the 1st.
Absolutely. And also just another really quick reminder to help support us. Follow us on Facebook. Go ahead and support our YouTube channels. We're publishing a lot of information on there. That's something we're starting to get more regular with, and that's something we're really, really pushing. It's a great communications tool. So please check out our social media outlets. All right, now let's go ahead and dive into Exhibit M, which is the bonus section, which, as Zeta pointed out, is optional. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you my hard, fast rule about the word optional. It's never optional. You will be submitting this. There's no reason not to submit anything that's going to help your application at this point. So forget that it says optional, because you will be including it. All right, so again, just kind of reading the language of the regs, or rather the application. In the event of a tie in scoring, the department may award up to 2 bonus points for preferred but not required initiatives in the following categories. 1, community benefits plan. 2, substance abuse prevention plan. And 3, a local community neighborhood report. Now, 1 and 2, for anyone that's kind of worked in the cannabis industry before or has applied for an application, that might seem familiar. Now, 3 is something that's actually kind of new to us. And so I want to kind of bring this to attention, because it is the local community / neighborhood report. We do not know how this is being defined by the state right now. So my team has reached out, and we're actually in dialogue with the state trying to figure that out. On one end, it might be as simple as digging up an existing city plan and adding supplemental notes to it. Or it can be as complicated as having someone out do a qualitative and quantitative analysis of the actual environmental impact and traffic impact and economic impact. We are not sure, but we are looking for that answer. So once we have that answer, we'll go ahead and make sure that it gets out to everyone so that you guys can go ahead and complete this bonus section. But again, the 3 aspects are community benefits plan. What are you going to do to help the community? How are you going to keep it safe? How are you going to help it? How are you going to enhance it? What measures are you going to do to make sure that your product isn't being illegally diverted, right? That's always something that you should be discussing in the community benefits plan, because you want to mitigate any possibility of you being a threat or risk to the community itself. 2, substance abuse prevention plan. My best suggestion is, if you've never put one of those together before, go ahead and Google it. That's not unique to the cannabis industry. A lot of the content that we use is not unique to the cannabis industry. You can find it online if you're clever. So what you want to do is go ahead and Google some of the best practices and the best national standards. In fact, what you want to do is draw from existing substance abuse programs and incorporate that into your own literature, right? You do not need to reinvent the wheel in this case. And in fact, a lot of times when you do try to reinvent the wheel, you're not going to do so. You're not going to do it as well as the other people who have been doing it. So again, source existing content for this one, the substance abuse prevention plan.
But I do think that, like, you could source existing content for this one, as Tom said, and I do think that there's, at the end of the day, but you do have to be specific, right? So, for instance, like the substance abuse prevention plan, I would like to, in that plan, I would like to see things like, okay, we've done a quick research analysis on the local community and where the problems are. Is it opioid abuse? Is it meth? Like, what is it, right? So how do we deal with that? And then aligning yourself with substance abuse prevention companies or nonprofits, or however you want to look at it, our facilities, and we need to identify who exactly those are locally in that community, right, within the plan. Now, everything else in terms of how you want to do that, it's a great jumpstart, but to differentiate yourself from other folks, like, you want to really kind of, dive into a little bit more detail on how, your substance abuse prevention plan is better than anybody else's, right? I mean, because again, imagine getting to a point where you scored exactly just like somebody else or another competitor, and now they're looking at these plans as a decision maker, right? This is like the end all be all last Hail Mary kind of deal. So you want to make sure that those are good. And those are very specific to your community and your spot, in terms of, how that's portrayed. Right. And so I think that that's a very important thing. Now, the next exhibit that we're looking at is location. It's Exhibit N, property ownership. I think we discussed this a little bit earlier in the webinar. We will go into further detail on future webinars coming up, but there was one question, Tom, and I wanted to see what you thought about this too as well. Which talked about, where is it? What if we are working with the owner to change the zoning? We've done that before, haven't we? I think we've done that in some other states where, it was improperly zoned and we have to go back to the city and say, no, well, we're going to adjust, some lines around the property lines and do a variance or things like that. So what do you think about that particular question, Tom?
So it really depends. We actually got this question before. So again, we're actually speaking with the state to kind of figure out the exact process. In the past, okay, so when you get your cannabis permit, one of the part of the things you're going to have to do is get a CUP. Now, traditionally, CUP stands for Conditional Use Permit. This was a way to issue variances, right? This was a way to kind of skirt your way around the zoning. Now, it's kind of become adopted into the larger cannabis practice since it is still federally illegal, so CUP has become a process, but that's generally what you need to return to. There are processes to issue variances in zoning. So depending on what your local municipality has in place, that's where I would start. I would go to my local city officials and ask them, what is the process for issuing a variance? How long will that take? And what will that require? Ideally, we'll get
the zoning too as well. I mean, because we've seen it to where you were, at one point, I've seen a couple, we've done a few of these, and I've seen, ones where locals, especially in California, we've done this, where, we've changed the zoning by, identifying it as something completely different than what it is, or maybe the site use too as well. I mean, what do you think, Tom?
Yeah, no, again, it's like, it really just comes down to what your actual local municipality is saying and what their best process is. So I would check in with them and see what their process for rezoning or offering a variance is. It might be a simple process that you can get through immediately and have it wrapped up and not have to actually worry about.
Right.
Or it might be as complicated as having to provide a bunch of additional documentation to the state demonstrating that. Now, forewarning, we're not sure if the state will allow. Sometimes we've seen states not allow that type of paperwork or type of additional procedural documents. Illinois has not said they are or aren't. That is something we're in communications with. So again, once we get that information more specific, we will go ahead and make it available. But it all starts with your local jurisdiction, your municipality.
Right. And that zoning department too as well, because, right on the Exhibit O, Notice of Proper Zoning form, it basically wants you to indicate that, what that municipality is, the zoning office department of that city or town, right? And that what's going to happen is when they go to vet that, they're going to call that municipality and say, is this location properly zoned? So it's really important to work with that zoning department or that planning department to ensure they know, what, that, piece is in terms of getting that clarification, right? Because they will verify that. And, this will come back into a deficiency letter at a later date. If you don't have, the notice of proper zoning form filled out correctly, or they call them up and say it's not properly zoned. So that communication there is where you're going to see a lot of challenges and difficulty, because interdepartment communications, as well as, state and city communications, we get issues there all the time, especially in the state. I mean, we're dealing with one of these issues right now, and just in our own hometown, right? So really very important to have that clear. Right, because they also want the title of the authority zoning representative, their name, their number, their signature. All these different things are part of that particular exhibit. So you want to get started on this now. So that about wraps it up for this webinar series. Thank you guys so much for attending. It's really exciting, to be a part of this and to support as many people as we can. Thank you, Dr. Tom, for participating in this process too as well. We got some future ones coming up every Thursday at the same time, addressing a lot of these different questions and basically getting as many answers as possible, both from the state as well as from hearing everything that's happening there on the ground. We do anticipate this process having a lot of applicants, especially for craft grower. I mean, we're expecting to see a significant amount of applicants here. Transporter, a lot too as well. in terms of people, going through this process and applying. So it's really important that right now you are going through all the things that, you need to in order to build your team, get your location, however you want to look at it. Start now, because once the application gets released, you only have 30 days to do it. So, again, really appreciate everyone, for attending this webinar, and stay tuned for the future ones. Thank you so much.